So hello and welcome to today's climate fiction seminar. So before we start, I'd like to thank a few people. So first of all, our research lab, Montpelliéraines, for funding these seminars. All the people here today, whether in person or online. And some people have come from far away, like our Swansea University colleagues. Thank you also to all the people who are here virtually. So I know that some of them are still arriving, but normally that should be okay. And Camille, whose idea it was to link the Journée d'Études and this seminar, which I think was a very good idea. And of course James, for co-organising all this with me and helping me carry the heavy equipment every time to be able to film these. I'd also like to thank a few of the artists who have collaborated with us. So we have David Leishman, whose music you hear at the beginning of all of these videos. We also have the people who have drawn paintings for our seminar. So we have Rémi Père, who did the first two, and Justine Laurent, who drew the watercolour painting that you have on the poster, which you'll see at the beginning of this video as well, and who is also a scientist, so showing yet again how art and science can complete one another and help illustrate and visualize abstract concepts like climate change, for example. So today is the third seminar in our series entitled Climate Fictions, which aims to explore different types of climate fiction in Anglophone literature and in the visual arts, soon, maybe. We'll see. Which James and I have been organising since October of last year. And today's talk is entitled The World of Science in Climate Fictions, Ambivalent Representations, Public Perception and Risk Communication. James, would you like to introduce Marion, or shall I carry on?
Do you have something already prepared?
I have something written.
Well, if you've got something prepared, maybe carry on.
I don't
Sorry.
know. Okay, so Marion Moussier recently completed her PhD in English literature at the University Paul Valéry Montpellier 3, Montpellier 3, in the research unit Études Montpelliéraines du Monde Anglophone, EMA, with a dissertation entitled Representations of Climate Change in the Contemporary British Novel, From Scientific Speculations to Human Experiences. She worked as a temporary lecturer at the Université Paul Valéry for several years before moving to Norway, where she is living now. Her research investigates the multiple interactions between cultural narratives, literary conventions, scientific rationality, and the potential of raising environmental awareness as crystallized in climate fictions. Her current research interests revolve around environmental risk perception and communication, climate change rhetoric, and the didactic function of literature. And her latest publications include A Dissonant Mind in a Dissonant Body, Allegories of Climate Change Denial in McEwan's novel Solar, for Études britanniques contemporaines, and the upcoming Voir le présent comme histoire, la fonction didactique du futur antérieur dans les romans sur le changement climatique, for the journal Cahier d'études du religieux. What's your turn?
Thank you very much for this presentation. Thank you for inviting me here today. It's a pleasure to talk about this topic with you. Thank you to the University of Grenoble and to the organizers and to everyone who's attending in person and online. We'll start with a brief introduction of what climate fictions are. So, novels making climate change their main theme have been growing in number in the last decades, so much so that it has led to the coining of the term cli-fi in the late 2000s, which has now become an umbrella term for fictions dealing with climate change. The label climate fiction is more a category than a genre, as it encapsulates a broad range of forms and styles. Climate fictions can be separated into two general categories, the anticipatory, set in the present, and the catastrophic, set in the future. The majority of climate fictions are cautionary tales, which often employ the traditions of dystopia or sometimes satire to provide a critique of today's industrialized societies. Futuristic climate fictions make up the majority of literary production and rely for the major part on the conventions of science fiction and the apocalyptic narrative. Critics have noted that recurrent narrative patterns, symbols, and images could be found in these fictions. Andrew Miller et al., in particular, summarized that representations of climate change are usually organized around tropes of fire, ice, and flood. That is to say, polar narratives, droughts, and flood narratives. A good example of this are the apocalyptic novels of J.J. Ballard's The Drowned World and The Drought, published as The Burning World in its American version, considered as proto-climate fictions, so as ancestors of the genre or the trend. Climate fictions are not only inspired by cross-cultural myths, such as the flood narrative, but are also inscribed within other national literary traditions. British climate fictions, for instance, could be seen as the legacy of the Wellesian scientific romance, polar expedition narratives that flourished in the 19th century, the timeless pastoral tradition, and more broadly speaking, as descendant of Anglophone environmentalism. Although most climate fictions take place in the future, stories set in the present or near future have recently contributed to a growing trend fueled by heightened concerns and further scientific evidence. They betray a shift in the representation of the crisis from a catastrophe looming in the far future to an ongoing event in the present. So as Frederick Well puts it, the global social environmental crisis is no longer seen as an apocalyptic end ahead, but has become a way of life. As climate-related international awareness grew in the 90s, so did fiction capturing the anxiety it inspired. Following the East Anglia Climatic Research Unit controversy, better known as ClimateGate, in 2009, that led journalists to affirm that global warming was a conspiracy, and the failure of the Copenhagen Conference on the same year, climate change discussions were met with increasing mistrust and disillusion. This disillusion and skepticism often serve as a framework or a setting for the plot of many recent climate fictions. Ian McEwan's Solar and Liz Jensen The Rapture are good examples of this trend, as we will see throughout this seminar. Whether they are set in the present or future, the majority of climate fictions are actively shedding light on current climate change data and predictions, often with a concern for education and prevention. A growing number of authors count on scientific plausibility to ensure a more positive reception of a novel that tries to communicate ideas or raise awareness on climate change. And this leads us to our next point. Climate fictions, being based on scientific data and often borrowing the conventions of science fiction, are yet another instance of the dialogue between literature and science. John Cartwright and Brian Baker trace back the interaction of science and literature to medieval times, although one could safely assume that relationship to be much more ancient. They state that, I quote, "The realms of science and literature in their common historical context have enjoyed a lively exchange of ideas. The exchanges have taken many forms, including satire, mutual admiration, and sometimes antagonism. According to them, I quote, writers have been quick to exploit the literary potential of new scientific ideas and have shown themselves especially skilled at expanding on their consequences and implications." So while scientific speculations are the matter of far future climate fictions, novels set in the present often have a thematic concern with the world of science or are told from the perspective of scientist protagonists, which brings a particularly interesting insight into the relationship between contemporary science, literature, and society. Before delving into these representations of science, I will shortly present the novels selected, all of which belong to British literature. First, we have The Stone Gods, a novel by Janet Winterson, made up of 4 parts set at different points in human history, from the 17th century to the far future. Each section features different narratives of anthropogenic environmental damage, including climate change, with a cyclical structure that stresses mankind's destructive tendency throughout time, providing a critique of the myth of progress and human exceptionalism. Solar by Ian McEwan tells in a satirical tone the life of a famous physicist who devotes his research to finding a solution to climate change based on solar energy. The novel takes place in the present, allowing the author to deal with current issues in ways that are inspired by contemporary science and politics. Its satirization of the world of science also criticizes the myth of progress, especially the hope that a technological fix will save us from climate change. The Raptor is an apocalyptic thriller set in a near future where natural disasters have become frequent as a result of climate change, and a team of scientists attempts to warn the public about a looming catastrophe set to destroy London. It is particularly efficient at capturing the zeitgeist of controversy and passivity surrounding the issue. The author has also done sound scientific research in order to make it as plausible as possible, basing the plot on a real-life risk assessment made by experts. Together, these 3 novels are enlightening to understand the representations of science in Western societies. And just to clarify last time, by representations of science, I do not mean the dramatization of scientific data into future scenarios, as is the case in science fiction, but rather the depiction of the current world of science itself. To begin with, I will shortly discuss the cliches surrounding the representations of scientists in popular culture, taking an example from Solar. Then I will focus on their public perception. This will bring to light a certain ambivalence in the perception of science in the crisis, simultaneously represented as a praised symbol of progress, as enabling mass destruction, and also as irrelevant and often ignored. I will then talk further about the perception of climate science in particular in the public and political sphere. And then I shall consider how climate science has been led to participate in a general controversy and how its multiple interpretations in the public result in the impossibility of collective action. This will lead us to focus on the communication of climate science, notably with the role ascribed to scientists when it comes to informing the public. I will then delve more specifically into some common methods of climate science communication in contemporary Western societies. This will pave the way for the final considerations on the limits of these communication methods and their impact on individuals as depicted by the novels. I will pay particular attention to some crucial topics at play in risk perception, such as psychic numbing, that the novels illustrate through the medium of their protagonists, often acting as proxies for the readers. First of all, it is important to acknowledge that the figure of the scientist has long been attached to various negative cliches, both in popular culture and classic literature, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein being an obvious example, but there are many others. Even if contemporary literature has evolved away from these cliches to some extent, this is a legacy one should be aware of when studying texts that depict the world of science with scientist characters in the foreground. According to Olga Pilkington, it is crucial for realist literature about the world of science to, I quote, dispel the stereotype of the scientist as crazed, reclusive, and up to no good. She explains that, I quote, real-life scientists have been perceived as secretive, unable to communicate outside their discipline, having different allegiances from other people, suppressing human affections, and ruthless in their idealism, prepared to sacrifice humans, animals, and safety in their reckless pursuit of knowledge. To her, this deeply entrenched misrepresentation of scientists, showing them as caricatures rather than as human beings, is very problematic. Addressing this point in Solar, the protagonist, himself a scientist, states that, I quote, the revolutionary lone inventor was a fantasy of popular culture and the minister. Here he is denouncing the overconfidence in a miracle technological fix to save us from climate change, fueled by hopes based on stereotypes. As Pilkington points out, it also seems that these stereotypes reflect a false, negatively connoted perception of science as a mysterious world with its own agenda, inaccessible to the everyday observer, which may fuel mistrust and conspiracies. For instance, Michael Beard, Solar's protagonist, is introduced as a scientific authority, a Nobel laureate in physics, and is portrayed as belonging to a specific closed circle, I quote, an inward specialized world where he was a celebrity, reinforcing the idea of science as its own enclosed world. This point is highly relevant to the question of how climate science is perceived in society and can clearly be observed in the novels, and we shall come back to it later when I will turn to the topic of controversy. I will now take an example from Solar, which is particularly representative of these stereotypes and where it is brought up in the context of satire. So one can find multiple scientist figures in Solar, which depart or borrow from these stereotypes at varying degrees. For many critics, Beard, the protagonist, fuels the satire of the world of science and shows the extent to which it can be influenced by politics and personal interests. He has also been read as an allegorical figure that impersonates the destructive flows of industrialized societies and climate politics, such as greed, denial, hypocrisy, and overconfidence on science and technology. Here, however, I shall not focus on Beard, even though he's the main scientist figure, but on another scientist figure who plays an important role in the novel, Aldous. The character of Aldous is most telling when it comes to the cliches associated with scientists and is therefore interesting to consider for this analysis. So in the novel, Beard supervises a team of postdoctoral researchers looking for a technological solution to the crisis. The team is described as, I quote, half a dozen underpaid postdoctoral physicists housed in 4 temporary cabins. They are representative of the younger, idealistic generation of scientists who, despite their qualifications, are impoverished and have limited opportunities for a career improvement. Despite this realistic representation of the little support given to scientists working to solve global environmental challenges, the novel, being a satire, also presents them in a caricatural light through the judgmental eyes of Beard, who mocks their idealistic activism for the cause. Eventually, the novel focuses on the character of Aldous, one of the postdocs, as Beard gets to know him more personally. We are told that Aldous, I quote, had applied to work at the center because he thought the planet was in danger and that his background in particle physics might be of some use. Aldous embodies the spirit of the alarmed, committed younger generations, an energy that Beard looks down on. Beard describes him as, I quote, a brilliant young scientist, not obviously likable, too self-obsessed, too narrow, too awkward in company. But many people were like that in his field. Aldous is represented as a solitary individual consumed by this subject to an excessive extent, as many characteristics reminiscent of the cliché of the scientist as an introverted genius obsessed with his work and with little social skills. Eventually, Beard comes to the conclusion that, I quote, climate change was consuming Aldous. Did he have other subjects? He asks, ironically. Yes, he did. He was concerned about the emissions from his car and had found an engineer who was going to help him convert it to run on electricity. So, to Beard's contemptuous yet critical mind, Aldous's monomaniacal obsession with the topic is problematic since it fails to see the bigger picture of the crisis with its complex multitude of entangled factors that extends beyond the question of carbon emissions. He tells himself that, I quote, the essence of a crank was, firstly, to believe that all the world's problems could be reduced to one and be solved, and secondly, to go on about it non-stop. So, the novel, drawing on stereotypes, the novel satirizes a certain type of idealism overly reliant on science and technology to solve complex environmental and social challenges. Indeed, according to Catherine Bent, just like Beard, Aldous is, I quote, yet another scientist character whose professional enthusiasm for the salvational potential of science is mocked. All in all, McEwan attracts the attention to the world of science and the little support it is given throughout the novel, and yet also satirizes the overconfidence on science and technology to face the crisis. And this ambivalence leads us to our next point. Throughout my research in British climate fictions, I have noticed a certain trend where science is presented as the driver of progress and modernity and is therefore linked to anthropocentric worldviews that have led to and justified environmental degradation. In addition, many novels criticize the overconfidence on science to save us from the crisis, as we have just seen with Solar. And on the other hand, most climate fictions are actively attracting the attention to climate change data and seem to take upon themselves the role of sharing scientific knowledge, all too often ignored. The ambiguity underlying this vision of science as both the cause, the warning messenger, and the cure of the disease is crystallized in the representations of scientists offered by climate fictions. To illustrate this point, I will focus a little bit more on The Stone Gods by Janet Winterson. In The Stone Gods, whose overall narrative criticizes the myth of unbridled technological progress and its total disregards of natural limits, this duality is particularly noticeable. On the one hand, scientists are among the main actors promoting the colonization of a newly discovered planet, found as an optimistic new solution to escape the consequences of environmental damage. During a public announcement about the upcoming colonizing mission, the narrator states that, sarcastically, that scientists, I quote, are automatically reassuring. This is a very exciting and very reassuring day. We are running out of planets and we have found a new one. In these lines, which could potentially be interpreted as satirizing mainstream techno-optimistic science fiction, it is implied that scientists are perceived as figures of authority who embody a comforting sense of human technological and control and mastery over the natural world in the public consciousness. They are presented as harbingers of a miracle technological fix and thus as saviors of mankind. Science is here associated with the power of modernity to shape and use the natural world for anthropocentric purposes. Moreover, science is linked to a type of rationality that commodifies and deanimates nature in the name of human exceptionalism. As the above quotation suggests, the planet is seen as a mere disposable and replaceable object. In a line that expresses this very exceptionalism, we are told that before human colonization of the new planet will begin, its local fauna will be exterminated, or, I quote, monsters will be humanly destroyed, with the possible exception of scientific capture of one or two types for the zoo. The novel criticized a worldview with science at the service of anthropocentric Enlightenment rationality, which has been the target of environmental philosophy in the past decades, especially the way of thinking that Dorothea Bourne calls instrumental reason. Bourne explains that, I quote, Enlightenment and modern science are based on the principle of instrumental reason, where things are reduced to serving a single purpose. In order to preserve the system and produce surplus value, instrumental reason eliminates all qualities and peculiarities of things. This applies especially to nature, which becomes a resource to be exploited or the presentation of a problem to be understood and solved by science's identifying thought. And then she quotes Adorno on the dialectic of the Enlightenment. Nature, stripped of qualities, becomes the chaotic stuff of mere classification. These last words echo those of the stone gods quoted above, where animals are spared and captured for the mere purpose of science, not because they have an intrinsic value as living beings beyond human use. Similarly, it is said during the public announcement about the new planets that, I quote, "This is a great day for science. The doomsters and the environmentalists kept telling us we were as good as dead." Interestingly here, science and environmentalism are perceived as two separate categories. In this sentence, what is celebrated is science at the service of anthropocentric interests, since it will allow the continuation of destructive modern lifestyles elsewhere. Overall, the novel satirizes the worldview that glorifies science as a tool for anthropocentric rationality and hegemonism. Furthermore, the novel also features the character of Robo Sapiens, a robot, or AI, designed to assist the government in solving human problems in a rational way. Robo Sapiens is programmed to be the voice of actual objective rationality as opposed to anthropocentric instrumental reason. And she states the undeniable fact that, I quote, "The ones who don't believe blame religion for the ills of the world. And while this is an attractive theory, especially among scientists, it does not account for the part that science and technology have played in bringing about mass destruction." Science is here clearly attributed the responsibility for enabling the crisis to happen. But the novel goes beyond the idea of science as a tool for destruction and anthropocentric interests. The Stone Gods adds a layer of meaning to the perception of science in the public sphere, one that portrays scientists as an ignored, irrelevant group at the margins of society. This neglect could be attributed to their obscure interest in so-called non-human matters that are automatically considered of secondary importance, deemed unrelated to human societies and concerns. Needless to say, this worldview betrays illusions of separatedness from the natural world and implies a binary distinction between human and non-human that the novel satirizes. Indeed, scientists are perceived as preoccupied with nature as opposed to the human world, an idea which is at odds with the vision of science at the service of anthropocentric purposes evoked earlier. Thus, it is publicly announced that the first building planned on the new planet will be a shopping center filled with some celebrities. And the protagonist, herself a scientist, asks, "I thought we were starting with a science station." And her colleague, who is working for the government, answers, "We are, but who cares about that? We need real people to keep the interest going. Scientists aren't interesting." The answer of her colleague, compared to the lines quoted above, "Scientists are automatically reassuring," and so on, exposes the paradoxical perception of science in the world of the novel, where it's an ambivalence one can recognize inspired from our present time. And scientists are alternatively praised as comforting heroes, saving us from the crisis, supporters of anthropocentric interests, blamed for enabling mass destruction, and seen as an isolated, uninteresting group whose research is irrelevant to the general public. In short, the figure of the scientist reflecting the public perception of science as an institution in general appears to waver between celebration and neglect, a crucial tension present-day climate fictions link to the political context. And this leads us to turn to the perception of climate science in the public and political spheres. It's not supposed to be like this, but... So climate change has led to an unprecedented politicization of science, its messages, and its actors. One would expect scientific research to be accepted as objective and neutral, a realm outside of human subjectivities. Yet it is sometimes perceived differently in the context of climate change. This can be in major part attributed to the fact that climate change requires large-scale policy-making with a direct impact on citizens, as well as a deep questioning of some core cultural values, which has a polarizing impact on public opinion. The involvement of environmental movements and activists, along with conspiracist groups who deny the reality of anthropogenic climate change and see it as a tool for political purposes, have turned neutral scientific data into a general controversy. The situation leads the works and words of scientists, normally viewed as neutral, to be interpreted as political statements, and therefore considered by some with mistrust and skepticism. This unprecedented presence of science in the political field is most clearly reflected in climate fictions set in the present or near future. These various misconceptions and prejudices are thematized in Solar, which explores in details the perception of climate science and its actors outside of their field. Directly inspired from our present context, the novel shows the media flourishing with groundless debates about whether evidence of global warming is actually flawed, creating a false sense of controversy, confusing audiences, and spurring doubts. As a result, Toby, who is a layman character and who can be seen as a proxy for some less informed parts of the public, tells Beard that, I quote, they is assumed the media, they're saying the scientists have gotten it wrong, but don't dare to admit it. Too many careers and reputations on the line. These assumptions play on the existing fact that scientific careers may be vulnerable to new research developments, but stigmatizes scientists as a self-interested group. These misrepresentations are most often reinforced by the general vision of science as its own separate enclosed world, an enduring cliché, as I mentioned at the beginning. For instance, Beard notes that energy investors were reluctant to take climate change data seriously because, I quote, they suspected that climate scientists were a self-serving industry, just like themselves. Likewise, according to Toby, the layman character, I quote, they're also saying that too many people are going to get rich on the Obama handouts and tax breaks and want to tell the truth. And there are all these scientists who've signed up to the Senate Minority Report on Climate Change. This is an actual document you can see here from 2009, released by the US Senate, gathering the statements of scientists who dissent from the consensus on anthropogenic climate change, and has been used many times as a reference by skeptics. It's interesting to know that the document is from 2009 and Solar was published in 2010, so that's really contemporary. Through the voice of Toby, the layman character, the novel illustrates the influence of the media on public opinion, especially when science is misrepresented. One can see that a false sense of controversy is created by disproportionately emphasizing the few marginal voices who signed the contrarian agreements, a false representation overlooking the massive consensus which allows climate change skeptics to dismiss the undeniable data by blaming it on the human flaws of scientists such as pride or greed or self-interests. Answering Toby on this topic, Baird stresses that, I quote, "Some weak-brained journalists write against it because they think it's a sign of independent thinking. And there's plenty of attention out there for a professor who'll speak against it. They are bad scientists, just like they are rotten singers and terrible cooks." Baird's words accurately pinpoint Andrew Dessler and Edward Parsons, who are scholars working on the perception of climate change. Observation that, I quote, "Journalists frequently do not understand scientific issues any better than do policy actors. Even when they do, journalists often follow a professional norm of providing balance between opposing views. Moreover, controversy sells newspapers. Since even settled issues may be debated by a minority, the press generally overreports scientific dissent and underreport consensus. Worse still, coverage often favors the dramatic, so the press may give particular prominence not just to minority views, but to extreme or eccentric views." That's headlines from 2009, so same time period. Solar brings here this question explained by Dessler and Parson. Solar brings this question to light in a clear and direct manner. Toby, the layman character, impersonates gullible public opinion, easily influenced by popular representations of climate science as an uncertain, controversial field, even among its specialists, inviting people to take a side depending on their political affiliation. Through Baird's scientifically informed voice, the novel proceeds to explain in simple terms the mechanism behind this distorted representation of the data. Baird starts by correcting the misconception about the rise in temperature and explains, I quote, "It's 0.8 now, and it's not negligible in climate terms, and most of it has happened in the last 30 years. And 10 years is not enough to establish a trend. You need at least 25. Some years are hotter, some are cooler than the year before, and if you drew a graph of average yearly temperature, it will be a zigzag, but a rising zigzag. When you take an exceptionally hot year as your starting point, you can easily show a decline, at least for a few years. That's an old trick called framing or cherry picking." Cherry picking is defined in the Merriam-Webster dictionary as to select the best or most desirable, which in climate change terms means taking isolated data to support the arguments that the overall warming trend is false, as explained by Baird in this latest quotation. And his explanation reflects this little graph pretty well, because if you want to do cherry picking, you would just look at a short period and you would look at a dip, but you don't look at the overall trend. So that's what he's explaining here. Exposing the cherry picking method, Stoller shows how climate science can be distorted to fit certain political agendas and manipulate public opinion, spreading the misconception that the scientific community is divided about the data. The technique described by Baird is commonly resorted to by politicians to instill doubts and take advantage of the public lack of scientific understanding on the issue. I'm sure we have all heard a politician or two say, when it's snowing, where is global warming now? Per Espen-Stoknes claims that, I quote, false arguments are built on cherry-picked facts and dressed up in forceful expressions to bolster someone's personal viewpoints against overwhelming evidence. So false arguments, cherry-picking, dressed up in forceful expressions, so using emotion in a way of communicating with rhetoric in order to convince people from a certain political agenda. Most importantly, Beard's explanation emphasizes the crucial and vastly misunderstood difference between weather and climate, one climate skeptics often play on, like as I said, pointing out when it's cold. Dessler and Parson explains that, I quote, while climate consists of average meteorological conditions, weather consists of meteorological conditions at a particular time. Thus, climate science and environmental concerns at large end up being associated with a particular political agenda, a point exemplified in the Stone Gods as well, where we read that, I quote, in America, a different kind of religious extremism committed to Armageddon, like the idea of the Antichrist appearing as a planet-saving Democrat. So it's quite interesting to see the religious metaphor used here. We were talking about it yesterday, that in climate change denial talk is often the use of religious metaphors mixed with some kind of political agenda. Now, after talking a little bit about controversy, we will move on to a similar topic, so the subjective interpretations of climate change data in the public. According to numerous risk perception and communication scholars, since there is no universal way to speak about climate change, we are given a multitude of constructed, conflicting messages that are then filtered in many different ways, depending on the subjective interpretations of individuals, then mediated by personal background, knowledge, experience, values, cultural norms, and circumstances. The resulting impossibility of collective action to face the threats due to its multiple interpretations in the public is precisely what is depicted throughout the Rapture. The world of the novel is one of conflicting opinions, both at the international and national levels. The protagonist is part of a team of scientists trying to raise awareness on potential natural disasters. Their attempts at warning the public are shown as repeatedly failing due to the different interpretations extreme weather events get globally. For instance, after the city of Rio has been hit with a hurricane, causing the collapse of the famous Christ statue, we read that, I quote, the net is buzzing with conspiracy theories. Christ's fall was caused by a remotely triggered mini-bomb, part of the 9/11 style Jewish plot. No, it was executed by Muslims on a hate mission. It was Iran's revenge. Clashing opinions and interpretations vie for dominance in an atmosphere of excitement, tipping into mass panic. Likewise, we read later that the swell of chatter in the wake of Christ's epic fall has burgeoned into an international interfaith babble of opinion and emotion. There are weather experts, structural engineers, geophysicists, stonemasons, religious leaders, psychologists, and even a conceptual artist dissecting the event. With this particular example of a natural disaster that happened to topple a religious statue, the Rapture illustrates that the focus on the common global threat of climate change will often be put in the background in favor of culturally influenced subjective interpretations of the issue that takes it outside the realm of science. In other words, the Rapture shows that, unable to collectively identify the threat and unite for action, nations and communities around the world are divided by subjective perceptions of the event, choosing words over actions and opinions over scientific facts. Commenting on the novel, Alexandra Nikolaris et al. Summarized that The novel is, I quote, suggesting that in every given place and time, human beings will conceptualize the fate of the planet from strongly diverging perspectives. The narrative thus implies that the ability to deal with different kinds of faith and trust and its opposites, disbelief, mistrust, doubt, and apathy, is a key factor in the future world's ability to mitigate and adapt, implying mitigate climate change and adapt to climate change. The actual scientific facts behind the issue are all too often lost in subjective interpretations, which participates in the difficulty of collective action as exemplified by the novel. Stefan Scrimshire concludes that, I quote, instead of rooting the climate narrative in knowledge claims of natural sciences and framing it as a numerical problem that can be solved, there is a need to understand climate change as a political and social construction as well as a physical reality. So, observing the world's reaction with the group of scientists who are trying to raise awareness on extreme weather events. Gabrielle, the protagonist of The Rapture, deplores that, I quote, depressingly, the fall of the Redeemer debate gathers momentum, obliterating the hurricane story. So climate change is not seen as a neutral geophysical threat to mankind, but is turned into a matter of debate. The Rapture illustrates how public opinion will focus on the symbolic, political aspect of an event rather than addressing its concrete scientific cause directly. So in the latest quotation, the fall of the Redeemer refers to the fall of the statue, so we can see the symbolic aspect being put forward by the media. The voices of scientists are drowned in a sea of subjective, culturally biased interpretations, which results in their warnings being ignored. And this leads us to our next point as we turn to the communication of climate science. The realist representation of science as neglected, which characterizes these novels and many climate fictions, is conveyed by the trope of the ignored scientist, usually the protagonist, who attempts to warn the public, a role taken by the majority of scientist figures in climate fictions, including the three ones I have selected for today. Scientist protagonists are often cast in the intermediary position of communicators, informing the public and political sphere about the severity of the environmental predictions. For instance, Baird's function as a representative of scientific authority is to, I quote, speak up in the press, encourage the energy industries to take an interest, and squeeze another 250,000 from the blustering minister. More than a scientist figure, Baird is an intermediary between the world of science and politics, a businessman and a public speaker, a complex position that enables the novel to depict what is for some the concrete reality of working with climate science. In The Stone Gods, the scientist protagonist, who is working with the government, is recruited on the first space mission to the new planet. Since the mission will be broadcast to the public, she has been selected because, as her superior explains, they need an expert who can communicate. They don't want a scientist type. To which she replies, I am a scientist type. This is interesting insofar as it reflects a general tendency where scientists are expected to be communicators of their field, act as experts, as intermediaries between their world and the public, to raise awareness on climate change data and take part in political negotiations. Paradoxically, the implied cliché behind the term scientist type echoes the figure of Aldous in Solar, as evoked before, who is described as isolated in his own world with little social skills and public influence. Climate fiction set in the present denounce the little attention paid to scientific warnings, crystallizing a contemporary anxiety about the lack of political response. Waiting for more results and more data, an excuse to delay financial investments and policy making to tackle the issue disguised as caution, betrays a short-termism incompatible with the timescales on which ways of fighting climate change could apply. In A Stone God, during a conversation between the protagonist and a governmental employee defending their poor handling of the environmental situation on their home planet, we see her interrupting him. He says, "We did what we did, sure, and when all the scientific data was in place," and she interrupts, "when it was too late." A similar scenario unfolds in The Rapture, where as the final disaster is approaching London and was predicted by scientists, we read that despite obvious scientific proofs and warnings, I quote, "the government has dismissed the alert as wholly unfounded, insisting that the evidence is not credible and the public should not panic, although leading figures in the scientific community are supporting mass evacuation." Disregarding the warnings of scientists, the government refuses to take action until the last minute, which has tragic consequences since the city cannot be evacuated on time. It is interesting to note that the trope of the ignored scientist protagonist trying to convince or warn the public about upcoming environmental disasters is such a recurrent motif in climate fictions, such as the three ones that we are taking as example today. To give but a last example, in The Rapture, we have a scientist figure who formerly worked at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, so that's a real-life organization, who explains that, "I quit a few years back, got fed up after spending 15 years modeling climate disaster scenarios and making recommendations that no one ever listened to. Went freelance after Hurricane Valentine." So this is a common type of character in present-day climate fictions. In the US literary production, one could think of Kim Stanley Robinson, maybe you know him, and his famous series Science in the Capital, which is all about the interaction between science and politics. Very interesting on this topic. Now, this being said, beyond the obvious hindrance caused by public controversy, political neglect, and short-termism in society at large, climate fictions also dramatize the psychological reception of risk at the personal level, exposing what might be some of the main reasons why scientific warnings face such resistance in the public at a deeper level. To understand this point more clearly, I shall first clarify some of the main science communication methods employed today when it comes to climate change. Mike Hulme, who's a geographer and expert in risk perception, emphasizes throughout his work that the manner in which scientific risks about climate change are communicated and framed in terms of storytelling, imagery, or targeted audience has an important impact on public opinion and policy discourses. One can identify several distinct ways of spreading scientific data in the public, some of which rely on an appeal to logic and some of which rely on an appeal to emotion. The ones who rely on an appeal to emotion are usually associated with the apocalyptic framing, and those who are appeal to logic could be linked to the traditional way of science communication called the deficit model, which posits that poor scientific literacy is the reason for inaction. According to Hume, public resistance to scientific facts is oftentimes assumed to stem from lack of knowledge, hence the word deficit. Linda Walsh explains that, I quote, knowledge was produced according to an enlightenment model by academic experts and disseminated through other sectors of society in a roughly linear fashion. This was the dominant mode through the first half of the 20th century in the Western world, and the one that gave rise to the deficit model of science communication. As Hume notes, this model also rests on the assumptions that the media remain neutral, the public receptive, and scientists develop communication skills, all of which are risky assumptions. Placing scientists in the role of communicators does not appear to be the most efficient method in the case of climate change, since their messages are often end up often being ignored, distorted, or rejected, as illustrated by the fictions. While this method of communication, with its appeal to logic and facts, has recently been put under scrutiny, the efficiency of effective ways of communicating information, such as those favored by the media, has also been questioned. Hume notes that the media often frames scientific messages with, I quote, emotive language and imagery, appealing to emotions such as fear of guilt, for instance, which might be risky and have unforeseen consequences. So both the logical and the affective communication methods are illustrated in the present day or near future climate fictions, which leads them to represent and explain through the relatable examples of their protagonists some common responses to climate change in the modern Western world. So we will turn to the perception of climate change at the personal level. Interestingly, solar has been criticized for its apparent lack of emotional engagement with climate change. Baird remains emotionally unconcerned by the issue, even though he works with it for a living, and displays an attitude of personal detachment and fatalism. This could first appear as a consequence of his selfishness, but his individualism may also be a protective mechanism against a world in which he feels powerless and overwhelmed. Baird describes climate change as, I quote, one in a list of issues of looming sorrows that comprise the background of the news. And he adds that he read about it, vaguely deplored it, and expected governments to meet and take action. And of course, he knew that a molecule of carbon dioxide absorbed energy in the infrared range, and that humankind was putting these molecules into the atmosphere in significant quantities. But he himself had other things to think about. This passage is interesting because it crystallizes some important elements at the heart of climate change perception in the West. Firstly, Baird sees it as one of many issues out of his control, which leads him to passively deflect responsibility onto the governments, to keep it out of his sphere of concerns. One could identify it as passive denial, or according to Stockness, you may know climate change exists, but prefer not to care much about it, which is precisely the attitude exemplified by Baird in Solar. Secondly, it is a background noise to which one cannot fully pay attention. It is understood and accepted as a scientific reality, as Baird's description suggests, but so remote that it appears unreal compared to life's immediate needs. Can we read the subtitles? Because this is from the formatting problem. I think it's barely readable.
Powerlessness and the double reality.
Yes, thank you. This is so it is understood as a scientific reality, but it appears unreal compared to life's immediate needs. And this is reminiscent of the feeling of double reality that Kari Mari Norgård observed in her field study of climate change perception in Norway. Her sociological research showed that people had both a sense of knowing and not knowing. she describes two coexisting levels of reality. I quote, in one reality was the collectively constructed sense of normal everyday life. In the other reality existed the troubling knowledge of increasing automobile use, polar ice caps melting, and the predictions of future weather scenarios. In other words, people did not lack information or concern, but could not think about it in their everyday lives, a tension well represented in the protagonist of present-day climate fictions. For instance, Gabrielle, the protagonist of The Rapture, admits that the latest projections predict the loss of the Arctic ice cap and a global temperature rise of up to 6 degrees. Zeitgeist stuff, the banality of abnormality. Its roots, in fact, so appalling, we turn the other way politely. So her perception of the issue reflects the sociological research of Nordgaard pretty clearly. Now, commenting on The Rapture, Nicorelis et al. Explains that, I quote, the situation is generally interpreted as being beyond human control, and the only way to deal with it is passive acceptance. Jensen describes a shattered world without hope. Reflecting on the discourse of a leading figure in climate change communication, Gabriel states that his underlying message seems to be that pessimism is the new realism. I do not doubt his projections or his figures or his graphs, but his conclusions depress me. Here we can see that both protagonists, Gabrielle and Baird, their perception of the issue hints that scientific knowledge might not be enough to motivate action, as they clearly understand the abstract data, but feel powerless and cannot incorporate it into their thoughts and ways of life. As Hume reminds us, scientific literacy is not the only essential factor in environmental awareness, as there are equally important psychological, emotional, and behavioral barriers. The efficiency of the traditional method of communicating scientific information, referred to as the deficit model, which I have just introduced, is shown to be quite limited by the attitudes of both protagonists, and they are quite representative of how people feel about the issue in the West, I would guess. So the novels illustrate the fact that, as essential as it may be, this type of communication does not take into account self-protective psychological responses, such as psychic numbing, to which we will turn now. Kyle Blado and Jennifer Ladino affirm that in the case of climate change, I quote, some people react to overwhelming data with psychic numbing. So it was first, psychic numbing was first theorized by Robert Lifton and could be defined as a reduced emotional responsiveness or detachment, often in response to trauma, overwhelming stress, or certain stimuli. And it can operate both at the collective or personal level. Similarly, Susanna Moser and Lisa Dilling suggest that if not accompanied by workable alternatives, I quote, various overwhelming environmental and societal problems on people's perception of the world may have this numbing effect. So the overwhelming aspect of climate change is reinforced by the way predictions often come in long lists of interrelated yet various issues, or in Baird's words, the familiar litany of shrinking glaciers, encroaching deserts, dissolving coral reefs, disrupted ocean currents, rising sea levels, disappearing this and that. In other words, overexposure to climate change data, what Gabrielle calls the banality of abnormality, leads to numbing. Both characters, so Stills, Baird and Gabrielle, psychological responses to climate change prove that they fully understand the data, but they have become too numb to this discourse to feel alarmed. the subtitle says, Alarm Discourse Dismissed as Apocalyptic Irrationality. So interestingly, as Solar also suggests that such attitudes could also be a consequence of the apocalyptic tone adopted in many types of climate change discourses in response to growing concern and general inertia. As Stockness argues, climate messages are threatening, apocalyptic, and overwhelming, everything that awakens our inner resistance. Baird parodies alarm discourse in order to justify his resistance, saying in a mock prophetic tone that, in the talks of activists, canonically pursuing, then overtaking disappointment was alarm. The Gulf Stream would vanish, Europeans would freeze to death in their beds, the Amazon would be a desert, some continents would catch fire, others would drown. Baird, so he works with climate change, just to clarify, but he's more like a skeptic about it. He only works with it for his own gain, because he gets big grants and so on, and attention. So he is actually a skeptic. So he ridicules the messages of alarmed environmentalists whose justified emphasis on the severity of future consequences of climate change is perceived with skepticism as sensational apocalypticism. One may also notice that Baird instinctively associates climate change with apocalyptic discourse, which allows him to dismiss more severe predictions as another false product of man's apocalyptic imagination, claiming that the apocalyptic tendency had conjured yet another beast. According to Evi Zemanek, I quote, Baird defames risk discourse in general without being able to disprove the actual prognosis. Indeed, Baird equates climate predictions to traditional apocalyptic tropes, arguing that they bear an Old Testament ring, an air of plague of bulls and deluge of frogs, to reject them as unreal and irrational without providing any scientific counter-arguments. Zemanek concludes that Baird's demonstrative imprecision, especially coming from the mouth of a scientist, articulates mistrust in the implied prognosis and suggests that the rationalist principally cannot be impressed by horror scenarios. In other words, alarming climate change data, especially if conveyed in the sensational tones of the apocalyptic discourse favored by the media, is likely to be associated with emotions and therefore dismissed as irrational and therefore unscientific. By contrast, the assumed rational position appears to be a certain skepticism towards the severity of the crisis, a response that Baird's reaction clearly exemplifies. So he's not a climate change denier, but is skeptics about how bad it actually is. Likewise, in The Stone Gods, environmentalist warnings are dismissed as delusional, depressive, and anti-science. Interestingly, Zemanek suggests that in Solar, the skepticism is, I quote, less directed against science than against its handling by the mass media. That is to say, the more apocalyptic way of communicating data. Hume asserts that the apocalyptic representations of climate change in popular films, such as The Day After Tomorrow, and many other such films or climate fictions, can increase anxiety about environmental risks, but they can also inspire skepticism about the probabilities of extreme weather. So there's an interesting conversation about what is the role of communicating climate change with emotions such as fear, because yes, it can motivate to action, but it can also have the opposite effect, such as numbing or dismissal, as in this case. So anti-environmentalist discourses are defined by skepticism and caution towards radical environmentalism, often recognizing the reality of environmental changes, but questioning human responsibility. In Solar, by parodying the apocalyptic discourse through the voice of a skeptic protagonist, The novel brings to light why this type of communication might not be appropriate to inspire political action or behavior change, as it tends to induce opposite responses, such as dismissal, skepticism, or numbing. Ultimately, both novels expose the limits of these communication methods through the responses of their protagonists. All things considered, while each model has its weaknesses and its strengths, and it is crucial to be aware of them, one cannot either come up with a unique, effective, universal way of communicating climate change, data, and risks. Therefore, Stockness calls for a plurality of diverse stories so as to reach various groups of people. To conclude, we have seen that present-day or near-future novels manage to offer realistic representations of science and its contemporary place in society. After short discussions on the cliches involved with the representations of scientists, we have seen that scientists were depicted with a certain ambivalence, which directly mirrors the ambiguous perception of science in the public sphere when it comes to the climate crisis, a theme climate fictions are fairly concerned with. I have explained the way in which climate fictions illustrates the entanglement of science and politics, since climate change has become an unprecedented, politically loaded issue. In addition, I have highlighted that scientists were often cast in the role of communicators or intermediary speakers, a difficult position considering the controversial dimension of the crisis. As a result, the efforts of scientists to warn the world are, for the most part, shown to be ignored, met with skepticism, or failing to spur action in all three novels, which I think we can say are representative of a general trend in present-day climate fictions. I have then linked this question to the way in which the novels portray some common responses to the most popular method of climate change risk communication, those appealing to logic and those appealing to emotion. The novels focus on public and individual perceptions of climate change, sheds light on and invites to reflect on some of the reasons behind the obvious lack of political engagement, behind the general inertia, illustrating the limits of some communication methods that are supposed to incite action. And in other words, by showing the intricacies and paradoxes involved with our understanding of climate change, both culturally and personally, the novels hint at why it is so difficult to bridge the gap between awareness and action, both at the global and personal level. And we will end with a particularly fitting quotation, at least for us in the humanities and social sciences, by environmentalist Bill McKibben, who says, "Science can take us only so far. The scientists have done their jobs. They issued every possible warning. Now it's time for the rest of us, the economists, the psychologists, the theologians, an artist whose role is to help us understand what things feel like." Thank you for your attention.
Okay, well, firstly, thank you so much, Marion, for coming. We were excited to hear about your research, and it chimed in so well with the theme of the seminars that we've been working on and the different papers we've seen so far with other invited guest speakers. I have a lot of things to say. It was such a wide-ranging presentation, but I don't want to kind of blurt it all out in one go. So I thought I'd just start with a first point, which is I wanted to think through some of the questions about to what extent the novels are maybe pessimistic or cynical about our ability to kind of meaningfully change things. And this sort of links also to one of the points you mentioned, which is this idea of psychic numbness. Like, we're bombarded by pessimistic discourse and imagery, and it does kind of give you the feeling that maybe we should just give up, which is expressed and talked about in the novels in different ways. But I was thinking kind of comparatively, because in The Stone Gods, structurally it's quite different, because you have the future but also the past, and there's a part of the book which is set on Easter Island, and the discourse is about like how, in fact, civilizations sort of almost inevitably or inherently are kind of programmed to use up their resources and destroy themselves. And then you get this sort of feeling that that's going to kind of repeat itself through history. We're always going to run out of resources. It's just we're not clever enough to get a grip of the situation. Whereas in Solar, and this can be linked, I think, to the idea of metaphor. We were talking yesterday, of course, a lot about climate metaphor. And I know Marie has some thoughts about metaphors in Solar as well. Would you like to borrow my phone?
Yeah.
I thought that Solar, in many senses, was a metaphor for McEwan's generation, that he is much the same age as the main character, Michael Beard. And you get these kinds of characters in a lot of McEwan's novels from that period as well, that you have in Saturday, the surgeon, Henry Perrone. You've got in Enduring Love, Joe, who is an academic, and even setting aside the sort of male characters, you've got also in The Children Act, you've got a woman, QC. So these are kind of all specialist characters. But in Solar, I felt that he was sort of telling the story of the failure of his generation in particular to deal with climate change, because they were the ones that identified it first. It was the post-war culture, so to speak, that started to look into this and had the science, but then for various reasons, they failed to kind of deliver on it in some way. And I don't know if you had any thoughts about that, and just thinking generally about the question of cynicism or pessimism in the novels.
Yes, thank you for your comments. It is true that, to start with, as a general trend, climate fictions appear to be more pessimistic, and even though they might help raise alarm, or they might be a good cathartic way of expressing the contemporary anxiety, it's not that helpful in the end, because you don't really have, especially apocalyptic novels, you don't really have an alternative that's presented, or any other way of imagining our way out of the crisis rather than the apocalypse. So it is true that it is a problem in climate fictions, and some people have said we need hopeful narratives that give us ideas of how we can move forward, post-oil transition narratives and so on, that are successful. But there's not so much in production, literary production at the moment, even though there are more and more creative novels that come out. So let's say the first wave of climate fictions that was mostly apocalyptic was rather pessimistic, but we have hope that it might change. When it comes to The Stone Gods, it is probably one of the most pessimistic, well, in a way, fictions I've read, because she shows indeed at different points in history humans destroying themselves by overusing their environment. And the point seems to be that no matter if it's in ancient history or in the far future, it's always the same cyclical loop of self-destruction: move somewhere new, colonize a new place, destroy it again, escape, and never learn. So it looks a little bit like pessimistic, and some scholars who've studied the novel say that, according to Winterson, she always says love is an intervention. So it seems to be like, for her, being she presents love as in openness to other life forms, might be the intervention we need in a cycle of endless destruction. So that might be a way forward. That's how it's been interpreted.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's a very sort of dim flicker of hope in the end of the novel, because it's some kind of post-apocalyptic wasteland, and it's a love story between a human being and a robo-sapien, so a robot. So, but you're right, I hadn't thought about that. There is maybe in a sense, a sort of small flicker of hope.
It's the redeeming quality of humans is love, and if we use it to be open to otherness, so that's what people have said who commented on the novel, the fact that it's also like queer and falling in love with a robot, and just like being open to other ways of being and loving all our companion species, as Harry would say. That could be a way out of this mindset of endless repetition, but it's a little small flicker of hope in the novel. In the end, it's still massively pessimistic. And when it comes to solar, with the generation point, I think it's really interesting. When I was working on the presentation, and I was thinking I need to focus on the solar, on the scientist protagonist from the novel, which one do I choose? And then I saw that there was this dichotomy between Beard, who is an elderly Nobel laureate, and he's not so much up to date with the new science, so he looks down on the new generation because inside he does not understand it anymore, and he's jealous because he's no longer in the spotlight. And you have the young generation of the postdocs, so Aldous is like the opposite of Beard, is the other generation, who are really up to date with all the science, who are brilliant, and he does not understand them. And in order to feel better, he kind of mocks their idealistic activism. He puts them down for this. But it also shows a generational gap where he's kind of out of the game. He's fatalistic about the issue. He feels like he cannot change anything, so it's just passive acceptance. He only works on climate change because he gets good money for it. Whereas young researchers, they have this passion, this enthusiasm to do something, and this kind of generational gap we see between the two. So I would say yes, absolutely.
I want to let Mary come in a minute because I don't want to neglect her at all, but just going on a little further with that idea of love, it's interesting because then again, thinking about Michael Beard as a kind of proxy was one of the words you used, or as metaphor is another way of thinking about it for his generation and the failures of his generation, is that he has these terrible commitment problems. So he has all these relationships with women through his life, but he's very he can't settle down with anyone. And I thought that was kind of an interesting metaphor in itself, that he couldn't commit to the science, he couldn't commit to the cause and actually make something meaningful out of his work. And that's also reflected in the idea of love or its absence, in fact. So if you're thinking about the stone gods as having a small flicker of hope, maybe in a way it has more hope finally than solar, which seems kind of surprising in a way in terms of their tone. I don't know.
Yeah, in solar, I think that whereas Aldous is satirized for being overly obsessed with the cause, it still shows that energy, because he was about to find a solution to climate change, not the solution to climate change, but a solution to green energy at least, and he died in a stupid way in an argument with Beard. And Beard stole his research, and when it was found that it was plagiarism, the whole project was shut down. So there was the hope that his research would lead to a solution in green energy, but at the last minute, because of Beard, this was shut down. So it's pessimistic, but in a way, it shows that, it was mostly Beard who ruins the.
Do you think that there's any significance in the name Aldous? It immediately brought to mind Aldous Huxley, and I thought, is there some reason why the idealist character is called Aldous? Could that be a link to other? I mean, Solar, I don't know if we can call it really a dystopian sci-fi novel. Of course, it explores themes which are adjacent to that genre, but I don't know, did you think about that at all?
I didn't think about it, but it could be.
Yeah.
I don't know about the names in Solar that could mean different things.
Yeah, well, I mean, Beard as well is very suggestive. It's like, what is the beard hiding? I mean, beards don't necessarily hide, but you do feel that a little bit with that
like
character.
You said about love, I forgot to reply to that. But yes, I guess what is criticized in Aldous is the excessive love, because it causes its own self-destruction, the excessive love of passion for the topic. So since it's a satire, it's either the lack of love or the lack of enthusiasm in Beard, or too much of it in Aldous.
Lack
and in
of
both
self-control.
cases, it doesn't work. So I guess it's exaggerated as a satire.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah, and of course we talked a lot about hope in our second seminar, as you remember, James, when we talked about the Ministry for the Future, which is, you know, a lot about hope and the future. I just wanted to link maybe this seminar with yesterday's Journée d'études on metaphors in controversial science, and I'd found a few extracts, mainly from Solar, where the scientist is communicating about science, and I thought that might be a bit interesting. And I had this quotation from pages 153 to 154, which I'm just going to read, and then maybe you can comment on it as, you know, the role of the scientist, etc. So this is the main character, Professor Beard, speaking in front of laymen, and they are described as a conservative lot, institutional investors, not scientific people. So he's going to adapt his language to that. So here is the quotation. Imagine we come across a man at the edge of a forest in heavy rainfall. This man is dying of thirst. He has an axe in his hand and he is felling trees in order to suck sap from the trunks. There are a few mouthfuls in each tree. All around him is devastation, dead trees, no bird song, and he knows the forest is vanishing. So why doesn't he tip back his head and drink the rain? Because he cuts the trees expertly, because he has always done it this way, because the kind of people who advocate rain drinking he considers suspicious types. That rain is our sunlight. An energy source drenches our planet, drives its climate and its life. It falls on us in a constant stream, a sweet rain of photons. A single photon striking a semiconductor releases an electron, and so electricity is born. As simple as that, right out of sunbeams. This is photovoltaics. So here we have, of course, a good description of what he is trying to promote, which is, solar energy. But do you want to comment on that and how he chooses this sort of image to promote the technology that he's working on?
Thank you. That's really relevant to what we said yesterday on using metaphors to communicate complex science. And in the novel, it's interesting to know that Beard stole this metaphor from Aldous, and he is using the power of storytelling, using techniques that belong to fiction, I guess, such as metaphor, to communicate and convince energy investors. And it is true that he knows he has to make use of rhetoric, and this is a very brilliant example of communicating science with storytelling. And the metaphor here is very useful in visualizing what's the problem might be that we may not be aware of, because when you are so much into a set worldview, where here relying on fossil fuels and so on, you might not see what's around you, but a metaphor can open your mind to a different way of envisioning the future or reality in a way that is more efficient and more visual than just explaining, oh, there's a lot of solar energy, we can use it like this and like that. But this metaphor is really powerful because it really shows that we can change the paradigm about how we see the future of energy industry. And it's very good at let's say bringing to light the less logical ways of seeing the world we have now, but we might not be aware of. And using this simple metaphor, it's a simple little story. You can apply it to many different things, so it's flexible. And applying it to photovoltaics, I think it really works for a layman audience, because the audience is not interested in the science. They are energy investors. They just want to know why this is good for them. And in this story, where he makes them feel kind of stupid for not adapting to the new solution, is also playing on like emotion and their own self-interest. It's very clever. I have nothing else to add, but this is a very
no, thanks a lot. And it's also
metaphor.
surrounded by this image of the planet is sick, if you remember.
Yes.
He's also sick physically as he speaks, and so there's a real link there. And also, when he says the planet is sick, you have groans from the audience, because, you know, this expression, of course, starting a speech like this. So I think, there's really this link between the sickness of the character, feeling sick, and being sick. He's literally sick at the end.
Yeah, I mean, that's the way I saw it again, thinking about him as a sort of a proxy for his generation. You know, he gets overweight, he consumes far too much, he travels all the time, he's not doing anything on a personal level to show his care for his environment. He's the kind of ultimate consumer in a way. Yeah.
Yeah, the metaphor of the planet is sick was also quite interesting.
And curing the curing the patient, the therapy which is needed.
It's a metaphor that simplifies the complex issue in ways that we can understand. So it really does its job as a metaphor.
I quite, if I may, just the crisp eating incident, which is one of the sort of best comic sort of vignettes in the novel, of which there are a few sort of great set pieces. So the audience understands, he sits down on a train carriage in front of a man, and there's a packet of crisps in between them, and he thinks it's the packet of crisps that he bought. And so he opens it and he starts eating, and the man stares at him and starts helping himself to the same packet of crisps. And they're both enraged, but for different reasons. They both think that they're stealing from one another. And then he gets down from the train and he realizes, in fact, that he had the packet of crisps in his pocket. Now, in the actual narrative, Michael Beard, the character, recognizes that it's an urban legend, that in fact it's called the unwitting thief, and it's existed already in certain stories. And I think Douglas Adams, the author of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, also put it in one of his stories and used it himself as an anecdote. But in the novel, I think it goes slightly further, because at the end of the incident, he's so angry, Michael Beard, that he grabs the man's water and just downs it all in one. And I saw it as perhaps he was taking this kind of urban myth stroke anecdote, and he was taking it a bit further, making it a kind of metaphor for the theft of other people's resources, but unwittingly so. Like, as a society, maybe we don't realize that the way we live becomes kind of stealing from other people, essentially.
That's interesting. I didn't see it this way, but absolutely. Because he says after this incident that it felt like a microcosm of all his flaws and mistakes in his own life, and knowing that his life is an allegory for overconsumption and modern societies, then we can keep the allegory going and see that, as you say, it applies to that. That's a very good point.
Yes, if we have any questions from the audience, don't hesitate. You just need to speak in this microphone for the recording, but that's the idea. And I think he uses the anecdote of the crisps in his speech afterwards, doesn't he?
Yeah,
he reuses
in his speech is recycling 3 different stories.
Exactly, and he's accused of having invented it.
Yes,
because it's so cliche that so it's a good anecdote. Yeah,
but it's interesting to think. I think in terms of what we were talking about yesterday, as well as like how do you communicate these ideas? Is a metaphor the best vehicle for talking about situations as serious as climate change, or should we, in fact, talk about it in, not layman's terms, but try not to sort of dumb it down for the public, you know. But which is another question I had, actually. I want to let other people
don't hesitate
chime in if they want. But thinking about the novels as vehicles for talking about these themes, did you have a feeling for which is the best vehicle for those kinds of ideas? I mean, reading them, Solar I'd read before, but the other 2 novels were new to me. It seemed that something like The Rapture was perhaps, as objectively as I can be, the most accessible novel, because it's a kind of horror thriller, and I think a lot of people would be able to read it like that without sort of feeling that they were being challenged on other intellectual levels. But at the same time, of course, McEwan and perhaps Winterson to a certain extent are very sort of respected writers, so they probably have kind of very high sales to their novels. I don't know how the different novels compare in terms of sales, but I wondered if you had any thoughts about that, because the Stone Gods seemed a much less accessible novel than The Rapture to me personally.
Yes, yeah.
Whereas Solar, I don't know, it's hard for me to say because I'm very interested in McEwan and I've read a lot of McEwan. But I don't know, did you have any feelings about that? Which of the novels might be the best as sort of at communicating those ideas?
Between these two in particular?
Or three, yeah.
It's an interesting question because so The Rapture is genre fiction, so it's maybe more popularly sold, and McEwan is also famous, so he might be also more sold. I don't know about who has sold most, but if we think in terms of how it's communicating science to the readers, I think they are both good examples of different ways of communicating climate change for the novel. Solar, it's quite interesting that it's a comedy and it's funny, so reading it is amusing, and there's a lot of metaphors and allegory throughout, so it's not preaching climate change, it's not appealing to fear or guilt, it's only showing a bad example, so Baird. And but he's not only a bad example because he's also communicating important facts, like I showed earlier, about cherry picking. He's talking about science in a clear way where you learn while reading, and you might not notice, but you still learn because it's embedded in the text. And also the fact that it has a lot of metaphors and allegories is an interesting way of reaching the reader on some complex topics. So there's another allegory we haven't mentioned, but that's really famous, is the boot room episode. So when he goes to the Arctic with a team of scientists and artists, they have a boot room where they have their gloves, their boots, and their suits. And at the start of the expedition, it's all clean. Everybody has their name and their own coat and their own boots. And by the end of the expedition, it's a mess, and everybody's taking just random equipment from other people. And he concludes that if people cannot manage organized resources in a simple room in a group of 6 or 7 people,
intelligent people,
how can they do it on a large scale? And then he concludes that boot rooms need good rules and policies in order to function. So it seems that he has more hopes in the power.
And it was based on something that actually happened to McEwan, I think.
And it's a very powerful, let's say, metaphor for the distribution of resources and how we manage the issue as a collective. So this was very powerful, and I think any reader can understand the parallel with the global or the situation in the West. So that was a good way, and again, approaching it through a comical lens that is not moralizing, that is not heavy and apocalyptic. That's a good approach. As for The Rapture, it might reach more people because it's kind of a genre fiction, but some critics have said that it is very apocalyptic, and this might be off-putting because of the flaws of the apocalyptic narrative when it comes to communicating data. And yet it's more complex than that because the novel is based on a real risk assessment, and sometimes you have the scientists, protagonists, who are talking about the risk assessment, who are explaining scientific ideas in a very realistic way. The author herself, the protagonist herself, I said she was a scientist, she's a psychologist, so she studies more the psychological dimension of climate change, but she's a layman when it comes to science, and so when she comes in contact with a team of scientists, they explain to her what is going on, they explain to her the risk assessment and how the science works, and she is like a proxy for us laymen. And so when we read how she's being explained, scientific discourse in quite a realistic style, then this is very, I would say, didactic because we learn with her. So this aspect of the novel makes it quite good. The apocalyptic aspect, I'm not so sure, but this aspect, yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Marie, well, somebody?
Does anyone have any questions?
Thoughts, questions? Remarks?
How we
10 to 12.
Sorry, no.
Maybe just a little anecdote.
Or do you want to come here?
Thank you. I was really struck by the very pessimistic and satirical tone of Solar by Ian McEwan. I haven't read the novel, but I kept wondering it's all very well to make fun about such serious issues, but it made me feel ill at ease, because even in the metaphor and the little story you gave, basically you have an embittered elderly man who is making fun of people who are really trying to change things for the better. So maybe there are too many experts and they don't have the bigger picture. But I'm just wondering if it's not another layer of discouragement and disillusion for everyone. And in the end, even if artists, if even artists who are the ones who normally have more imagination, more hope to give to their society, and who might lead the way, seem to have given it up altogether, it seems to me that it's a bit problematic. So I know that artists are not there to solve all the problems that we as a collective cannot solve. But when at one point, when you were speaking, actually it was about Winterson's The Stone Gods, and this idea of colonizing other planets. I couldn't help thinking, because you had just been speaking about because on the other hand, Ian McEwan is very clear-sighted, and he's so clever that he sees exactly where to satirize what is really not going right. But it made me think of one of the latest, quite extraordinary and almost fictional things that happen these days. And so this time, this was not Musk, this was not Trump, this was Bezos sending into space Katy Perry. And then, oh, this is about the empowerment of women, this is just a group of women. And everything is becoming a farce. And it seems to me that by discrediting once again both the embittered old scientist and the young one, having the young one die, it is ethically not something I would have chosen if I was a writer, because I think that enough is enough. And what you've said about numbing, we keep being bombarded by distressful and terrible scientific data. So I'm not sure about the deficit. I can't remember how you call it. The deficit model. Yeah. I think actually most people, most relatively well-educated people, understand what it is all about. But precisely, we are not being informed about how it could get better, but only about the disastrous consequences of what we've not done up till now, or what we've done and not found solutions for. And I think very simple things like for all governments in democracies asking for newspapers or for any piece of even political speeches having 1/3 about possible solutions and things that do work and that have worked elsewhere might actually help. And for me, it's also part of the artist's mission. So it's a bit more of a militant tone than an analysis of either the literary technique or what each author wants to achieve. But I'm really struck by the fact that, as you mentioned, in this cli-fi dimension, and you mentioned yourself that maybe it's just the first step and the first main generation of writers and artists who will work on climate change. But it seems that even artists, they are in that state of numbing. And so maybe to come to a question, are you aware of any major artists, whether writer, poet, or plastician, visual artist, that do things that, well, there are many, I guess, but that have, well, maybe there are many, but we don't hear that much about them either. So that will, for instance, have not only their work to offer, but if you participate, you can either give money or do something differently in your own lives, etc. Is that something that, to your knowledge, is developing?
Thank you for. I can have. Yeah. Thank you for your very interesting comments. I will just reply to what you said at the start about Solar and killing the young scientist and making fun of him. I absolutely agree that the problem of the novel, and that's why it didn't have such a good public reception at the start, is that it is so focused on Baird, who is a negative example because he shows what not to do. But people who actually have something to say or some kind of emotion or commitment to the issue are being silenced. So there's his girlfriend who expresses this idea of double reality and numbing and how she struggles to integrate it into her everyday life. And she is silenced, and Aldous is also has something to say and to bring, but he's also silenced. And some people found that frustrating about the book, that in the end it's all about Baird and there's not so much hope because the only people who can speak about it in an emotional or hopeful way are silenced short before anything can be achieved. So yes, that's a problematic aspect of the novel. That's Mike Ewan's choice. It's an interesting choice that he made to take a satirical outlook, but it's also not that uplifting, we could say. And that's a very general trend in climate fictions, unfortunately. You asked if I have examples of positive stories, and I don't know if it's that the fact that I haven't read enough of what has just came out now, or if it's because overwhelmingly it's all quite negative. I think there's a distinction between the first wave, as I said, where it was all apocalyptic and it was more like a reaction to anxiety being expressed in book to show people how bad things are. So it was more like a reaction to alarm. That's understandable. But I think now it's moving a bit to more complex works, exploring what can we actually do next. Now every apocalyptic story is looked upon a little bit frowned upon nowadays because we moved on from that, and it's seen as unproductive and also very reductive because it's Western society saying there's nothing beyond capitalism but destruction. It's a failure of the imagination. So we moved on from this, and now there's more fictions about environmental justice and so on, and less about apocalypse in the global north, and more looking at climate change consequences now, but on other continents. Whether they are positive messages, I'm not so sure. Maybe there may be individual stories of people standing up to an oil corporation and defending their rights and their village, for instance. But overall, positive stories providing alternatives about how we can face the issue, I'm not aware of. Maybe it's just my own lack of reading on recent fictions. But unfortunately, that's a problem of the field. Whether it is in culture, so in literary production, or in the way we communicate it, it's not so much an emphasis on the positive of what we can do, but it's more about brace yourself for what's coming. And so that's a general problem.
I think in mitigation also, it's worth considering when these novels were published. So they were all published in the 2000s, and in many ways they seem quite prescient because climate skepticism presumably existed at the time that Solar was published, but I think it really kind of anticipates a lot of the culture wars and the way that people fall on one or other side of the climate debate, depending on kind of where they sort of land on a variety of different issues. And I feel like in that sense it was quite smart, and it sort of, you talked, it was very interesting about the Minority Report on climate change. So that it was obviously reacting to things that were happening just at that moment, but which have in fact sort of planted a seed of cynicism and skepticism that haven't really left. In fact, if anything, they've kind of grown and become more monstrous since that time. Yeah,
skepticism and like I said, this is very 2010. All three novels are around 2010, so that's really the atmosphere of the time that reflects on the literature. And it feels like now skepticism and climate change denial is not the bigger problem, at least in Europe. I don't know about the US right now, where it's regressing, but it feels like it's in the British context, it may be more a problem in the 2010s. And now it's like, we know about it. We're not skeptic anymore. Just give us alternatives to what we can do. And we'll see what the next generation of climate fictions will bring. Because we are all tired of this type of...
Well, I think that's a good conclusion to the third seminar of climate fiction. So thanks a lot for everyone for being here, online as well. I don't know if they're still around. And thank you to Marion for your talk and for coming all the way from Norway, since that is where you were. Yes, of course. But just say you were here for that. But, so thanks a lot, and hopefully see you all again soon, especially for those who have come from far away. Thanks.
Thank you.
Do we have to do a final clap?
Oh yes, fine.
Final clap. So what a privilege that is.